Hello and welcome to today's Subscriber Sunday. The question today comes from Molly, and it's a really good one, but it's also a really sad one. It makes me very sad, but I'm going to cheer myself up by answering it for you. So she's been watching my video on Utterson in Jekyll and Hyde and says, thank you so much. Really hoping I'm able to get a grade 8 for my paper 2 mock. Also, my English teacher told me we don't need to mention context in our Jekyll and Hyde essay. She's doing EdXL, but that doesn't matter for this video. Is this true? And thank you. So my answer is the title of this video, which is What About Context? Well, let's have a look at the assessment objectives that aren't context, because I'm going to show you that those two assessment objectives, AO1 and AO2, depend on context, even though context is not mentioned in them. Let me take you into Jekyll and Hyde to show you what I mean. So, the first thing you have to do for assessment objective 1 is respond to text critically. So, if you're being critical, you're coming up with an argument. That's your top way to get a grade 7 and above. Whatever the question is, you're coming up with a point of view you're going to argue. Well, if you're going to do that, you need to mention the author's viewpoint. Now, the only way to get into the author's viewpoint is to look at the context at the time. You have to say to yourself, what about his society, if it's a male author, or what about her society, if it's a female author, were they trying to change? And that only comes about if you have an understanding of the context, because that's their society of the time. It's very easy to be imaginative if you start looking for clues in the society of the time. You can come up with some really interesting interpretations. However, if you don't mention context, you can start having all kinds of flights of fancy which won't get you marks. Let me show you an example. Let's imagine that I look at the death of Jekyll at the end, and he's created this evil being, this monster Hyde, and eventually Hyde kills him. It would be very common for a 21st century reader such as yourselves to say, well, this is karma, isn't it? And write about karma in their essay. Well, what's the problem with that, Mr. Salles? The problem is Stevenson and his audience would not have known what karma was. This wouldn't have been a concept around at the time, and therefore your argument about karma is kind of duff. Even though you're absolutely right, it is karma. But from Stevenson's perspective and from his contemporary audience perspective, it isn't. So your imaginative interpretation gets a little dodgy, unless you can show that that is a modern reading. But you can only show it's a modern reading if you understand the context of the time. You see what I mean? Okay, well, that's just one of our 6 bullet points. Let's go to number 2. What happens when you evaluate? Well, that's really simple, and it's connected exactly with interpretations. Well, this is what you do. You evaluate different points of view. So, for example, let's take the creation of Hyde. Hyde could be used to argue that science has finally overtaken God. In other words, it's overtaken the belief in a benign or even a judgmental God who is rewarding people for good and punishing people for evil, because Hyde is able to carry out things that he wants to do without punishment until he gets caught. But for all of that time, he is free to do as he wishes. Now, if that science exists, Stevenson could be arguing that we all are able to indulge in our sinful nature if we are a well-off Victorian gentleman. That is his social point. So what he's saying is, look, reader, in this story, yes, I'm punishing the evildoers, but in real life that doesn't happen. In real life, there are gentlemen all over London getting away with everything. London gentlemen are hypocritical. They have a false face like Jekyll, but underneath they have the lusts and desires and sins of Hyde. You know, that is his whole point. Well, that's one point of view, which depends, of course, on your knowledge of context. However, you might say, no, I have a competing point of view. Stevenson's point of view in the novel is absolutely Christian, and because the creation of Hyde seems to challenge the authority of God, because only God can create new life, then the creation, Hyde, is destroyed, and so is his creator, Jekyll. This is God's vengeance, God's justice, God's punishment. Therefore, it is a Christian novel. Well, that interpretation also depends on context. Now, both interpretations, the Christian one and the scientific one, and the social commentary of the hypocrisy of middle-class men, both depend on you understanding context. And which one you choose is how you evaluate. Okay, so you say why one interpretation is good, but why the next interpretation is even better. And because context is there, that gives you a way of judging. So, my next bit of context to judge this would be to say that I'm not going to go with the Christian interpretation. I'm going to go with the social commentary, and I'm going to link that to the fact that Stevenson left Great Britain. He chose to live abroad. He rejected the hypocrisy of the society of his day and went to live a much freer life in the apparently savage lands of Samoa, where he could behave a lot more like Hyde. Okay, now I can only use these interpretations fully and evaluate them fully if I know about the context. Even though context is never mentioned in AO1, I've absolutely smashed critically, imaginatively. I've been able to evaluate, and I've offered several interpretations. Boom! Well, what about AO2? Okay, well, when I'm explaining about language, I don't need necessarily to talk about context. However, it would be an advantage. So, for example, if I want to talk about the women who first meet Hyde when he tramples on the little girl, and they're described as trying to get at him like harpies, these mythical, vengeful Greek figures from Greek myth. Well, yes, I've got the context of Greek myth, but I've suddenly also got a female perspective, or rather a perspective on the females. Because you'll notice there are hardly any women in this novel, and those that do appear have only small parts. Well, I can argue that that reflects a deeply sexist society where women only have marginal influence on their men. I can go a step further. The women in this novel are described in a very negative light. So these women are described as harpies, they're evil, they just want to murder Hyde, and all he's done is knock a girl down. I mean, he hasn't even injured her. But they actually want to kill him. A complete overreaction. They are much more evil than he is. Then we have Hyde's landlady, and if you remember the description of her, or if you don't, go back and look at it. The description of her shows how much pleasure she takes in other people's misfortune. She's a really vindictive character, and it's reflected in the description of her face. And then the next woman is the apparently innocent maid who sees the savage and brutal murder of Sir Danvers Carew. But there's a little telling line in there where Stevenson points out that she keeps retelling this tale, milking it for all it's worth for the rest of her days. Now, that shows that she takes a vicarious pleasure, a joy in watching this murder. How evil is that? So, when I examine the word harpies, if it happens to come up in my extract, everything comes back to context. Similarly, with the structure of the novel. So, Jekyll and Hyde is structured in a non-chronological order. Well, why does he do that? Well, because in the context of the time, there is a new fascination with the detective story. We have writers like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle writing quintessential detective stories. The reader wants a mystery to puzzle out. Well, how much easier it is to create a mystery if you jumble up the order of events. Then it's really difficult for the reader to catch on to what's going on. Similarly, we keep seeing the action through the eyes of Utterson, who of course does not have the full picture, and therefore we as the readers don't get the full picture, and the mystery is harder to unravel. And that is also the form of the novel. The form is a detective form. Okay, and when we write about that, we can only do so brilliantly if we know about the context. The other part of the form is a comparison to the penny dreadful. And the penny dreadful, the clues in the title, these were dreadful books full of dreadful deeds, so true life crime sort of stories, and they cost only a penny. They were supposed to be written really quickly, and they were just sensational, and they fed a public desire for scandal and for horror. Well, that's exactly what Jekyll and Hyde is. It's feeding the public something that they want. Now, I can link that to my interpretations by saying that Stevenson could be deeply critical of his public for wanting this kind of cheap sensationalism. And you can look at the novel as less cheap sensationalism. I'm going to give you sensationalism, but it's going to have a moral and social purpose. I'm going to look at social hypocrisy and the evil of middle-class gentlemen in our society. That only comes, that interpretation, from our knowledge of the context. And likewise with themes, well, I've talked about the themes all the way through. You can chuck in the duality of man there. Yes, that's a universal theme, that we all have good and evil inside us. But if I jump into the context and look at Victorian London, I can be much more specific. And similarly with settings, if you've watched any of my videos walking around London, looking at Jekyll and Hyde's London, you'll notice that the settings are really specific. So it's really interesting that Jekyll's house is in Leicester Square, which is an area that's quite wealthy, although it's on its way down if you look at the description of it. And Hyde, his setting is Soho, which of course is symbolic of sin and lust and people getting away with all sorts of things in secret that they couldn't do in public. Well, when you actually look at London and Soho and Leicester Square, they're actually right next door to each other. And that links us straight back to the idea of the duality of man. So the very setting of London has this same dual nature, split between good and evil. So, hopefully I have convinced you that context is relevant to all the assessment objectives. Context, of course, is assessment objective 3, but it helps you have a much better discussion of your interpretations and a much better discussion of the language, form and structure. Indeed, I would argue that you can only argue these two effectively if you know deeply about context. So if we go back to Molly's question, her teacher is technically correct. You don't have to mention context because it's not in the mark scheme. But if Molly's teacher thought differently and ignored the mark scheme and just said, what would make an absolutely spanking essay, one where the writer, the student, was writing like an expert in English literature, well, that expert in English literature would do all of those things highlighted in yellow. But to do them well, she or he would have to use their knowledge of context. Hopefully, that has persuaded you to do a little bit of contextual research. If you can't be bothered to do it yourself, just tune in to any of my videos. I've got loads of context for you and learn how to get the very top grades. Thank you for watching and goodbye.